Up to this point, we've discussed and defined several key terms and distinctions, as well as covered various concepts that we need for engaging arguments and positions philosophically. We've talked about some key components of argumentation, distilling arguments, and argumentative evaluation. Today we're going to turn to the subject matter of this course, namely ethics. The purpose of this lecture is to provide a brief overview of the field of ethics, what we study when we study ethics, how we go about developing an ethical theory, and to provide a characterization of the meaning of ethics. Now, the term ethics is one I'm sure that is quite familiar to a number of you. You've certainly heard people discuss ethics within the field of medicine, or maybe you've heard people talk about professional codes of conduct. You've probably heard people described as being ethical or unethical. It's something that's a subject matter of politicians, movies, and various other outlets where you hear people discuss ethical behavior. But what exactly is ethics? Surprisingly, despite the fact that this is a familiar enough term, it's notoriously difficult to pin down exactly what it is. What I'm going to try to do is to provide you an overall characterization of what ethics is. And when we discuss ethics, we can identify a few important features of what ethics amounts to. And one thing we can say is that ethics studies what we call normativity. Now, when we talk about normativity, what we're referring to is a norm, and a norm is a standard of behavior. Normativity studies ought and ought not, should or should not. And a helpful way to understand what normative is to contrast it with the descriptive. Something is purely descriptive if it merely describes and tells you how something is. But this is different than telling you how something should be. For instance, if I say that you have neat handwriting, that's merely descriptive. If on the other hand I say you should have neat handwriting, then I've made a normative claim. Normative involves the should not, the ought not, whereas the descriptive merely tells you how things are. And when we talk about normativity, we should note that there are various forms of normativity. Normativity is all around us, in fact. For instance, we have grammatical norms. You might consult a standard grammar book and it'll say something like, you should end a sentence with punctuation, or you should begin a sentence with a capital letter. You should not splice your commas. That is a normative claim. If I merely point out to you and say, hey, look here, you did not begin your sentence with a capital letter, that's merely a descriptive claim. But if I go on to say, you should have a capital letter, then I've made a normative claim. We also have norms of reason. We've discussed these already. You may recall one of the examples I gave of a bad argument. Obama wears mom jeans, therefore he is a bad president. And what we said is that this violates a certain standard or norm of reason. What's the norm that it violates? Well, basically just this. The premise is not relevant to the conclusion. And there is a norm that says that premises should be relevant to the conclusion. There are also social norms, things that you should do in polite society. For instance, you should hold a door for someone. You should not cut someone off in traffic. These are standards of behavior. Likewise, we have legal norms. Another way of describing a legal norm is just to say we have laws, things that you should or should not do, or else you'll bear some kind of penalty for doing that, for violating that particular law or legal norm. So ethics studies normativity, but what distinguishes ethical norms from other kinds of norms? I want to highlight a few ways in which ethical norms are distinguished from these other kinds of norms. And one thing that stands out is that ethical norms tend to involve harms to others. When we think about doing something that's unethical, typically we think about one person injuring or causing harm to another. If, for instance, I don't start a sentence with a capital letter, well then I've violated a grammatical norm, but I haven't really hurt anyone. Now this might cause frustration for your English teachers, but they haven't been injured. I don't think they're going to lose any sleep over you failing to use correct punctuation. But if, on the other hand, you were to slap your English teacher in the face, well, then you've done some kind of harm to that person, and that would be an act that's unethical. Now, I say ethical norms tend to involve harms to others because arguably there are harms you can do that don't necessarily or directly harm another person, but some people would consider them immoral nonetheless. For instance, suppose that I have an old tree in my backyard, and let's say this tree is 1,000 years old, and then just for fun I go out and dump battery acid all over the roots of the tree and kill it. To some people, I would have done something that's immoral, even though I haven't technically harmed anyone else. Perhaps for all the world knew, that tree never even existed. Maybe I'm the only one who knew it was there. But still, it seems like I may have done something that was inappropriate or wrong. Or suppose, let me share a story with you. When I was a kid, my father had a friend, and his friend's grandson went to his pond and caught a number of fish, and then he just laid the fish on the bank and let them die. He had no intention of eating the fish. He had no intention of mounting one on the wall and keeping it for a trophy. He just caught them and then let them die. Now, has he harmed another individual? Well, maybe he's indirectly harmed his grandfather, but even if we can't say that, it still seems like maybe he's done something wrong. And why? Well, it's because he's harmed the animals, not necessarily because he's harmed another person. So, arguably, there are certain kinds of environmental harms that you might do, even if they don't directly harm another person, you still may have done something unethical, at least according to some people. Likewise, some people think you can do certain acts or perform certain acts that don't harm anyone else, but are still immoral. Why? Because you've harmed yourself. For instance, many people regard suicide as an immoral act. And if that's the case, then even if you don't necessarily harm someone else, you've done something arguably that's unethical. Some people also regard having lustful thoughts unethical or immoral. Even though you don't necessarily harm someone else, you've done something that's wrong. So ethics tends to involve harms to others, but I'm pointing out that arguably there are other kinds of harms that you may do as well that aren't necessarily harms to others, but are harms to yourselves or maybe harms to the environment. Secondly, ethical violations tend to reflect very important kinds of norms. And this is demonstrated in our extreme attitudes when people violate ethical norms, when they do something wrong. Think about again someone splicing a comma, or someone, for instance, not beginning their sentence with a capital letter. It would seem grossly out of proportion if someone failed to start a sentence with a capital letter, if your teacher got right in your face and yelled at you and said, "Hey, you immoral scumbag, how dare you? You didn't start your sentence with a capital letter, you piece of crap, how dare you do this?" That kind of response would just be way out of proportion. There's no call for that. You've really not done anything in the grand scheme of things that's terribly wrong. On the other hand, if someone commits murder, then that kind of reaction might very well be justified. If, for instance, a man were to rape and murder a woman, then you could very well understand people getting in his face and telling him he's immoral, he's a scumbag, he's unethical, he's a piece of crap. We have extreme attitudes that seem to correlate and be appropriate responses to ethical violations. And what this demonstrates is just how important these kinds of norms are. Uh, Also, we should point out that ethical norms are in some way distinct from social norms. There are certain things that you should do in polite society, and if you fail to adhere to these, we wouldn't typically describe your action as being immoral in any sort of way. For instance, typically it's regarded as fashionable to wear brown belt with a brown pair of shoes, or to wear a black belt with black pair of shoes. But if you were to mix and match these, even though it might be unfashionable, even though it might violate certain social standards, you wouldn't describe the person's actions as unethical. Or again, if you cut someone off in traffic or someone cuts you off, you might say that the person is rude or the person is a a-hole, but you wouldn't describe them as immoral. Or if someone fails to hold the door for you, again, you might say they were rude, but you wouldn't describe them as immoral. One of my favorite cases of a social norm, and maybe one you haven't thought about, is that people instinctively face forward when they get on an elevator. But think how weird it would be if you were to get on an elevator and a person came in and they just stared at you. They didn't turn around and face the door. They just stared to the back and looked you straight in the eye. Now this might be weird, this might be creepy, and maybe it'd be in your best interest to get off on the next floor, regardless if you were going to originally or not. But the person isn't behaving unethically. They're weird, they're awkward, but not immoral. Finally, we should point out that ethical norms are distinct from legal norms. There are many things that are illegal but not necessarily immoral. And there are some things that are immoral but not necessarily illegal. For instance, cheating on one's spouse. That's something that most people would regard as immoral, but it's not necessarily illegal. I know in the military there are laws against cheating on one's spouse, and you can actually serve jail time for it. But in the rest of in civilian life, this is not something that is illegal. It's not something you'd go to jail for. Now, certainly cheating on one's spouse could have huge ramifications when it came to a civil suit in the court of law. But you would, like I said, you wouldn't go to jail for cheating on your spouse, even though it would be considered immoral. Alternatively, an act of jaywalking. That's technically illegal, but it's not something that would be considered unethical. And we wouldn't pull over or slow down or say to someone, hey, you're immoral, you scumbag. How dare you walk where there's not a crosswalk? Or how dare you walk when the light isn't green and it's red? These things aren't considered immoral, even though they are technically illegal. So I've tried to give some characterization to what exactly ethics involves. Like I said, it involves normativity, but it's a distinct kind of normativity. And we can maybe get a further clarification of what ethics involves if we look at several types of questions that are distinctive to the field of ethics. And here are a list of some. Some of these we'll get to discuss in this class, others we won't. But here's a question: is abortion morally permissible? Now, when we talk about the permissibility of abortion, we could talk about the legality also. We might say something like the following: should abortion be legal? But whether or not abortion should be legal, there's also a distinct question as to whether or not someone does something unethical if she were to have an abortion. And surprisingly, the common opinion in the United States is that abortion should be legal. The overwhelming consensus is that it should, at least in certain circumstances. However, the majority of people also think abortion is immoral, or there's at least something morally questionable about it. And many people feel that abortion should be legal, but it should not be used as a form of birth control. So even though you'd be well within your legal rights to use abortion as a form of birth control, you'd be doing something that many would regard as unethical. Another type of ethical question: is embryonic stem cell research morally permissible? This is a hot button question that comes to public attention from time to time. Another type of ethical question: is there such a thing as a just war? Or what reasons would justify going to war? And in the history of mankind, people have offered all kinds of different reasons for justifiably going to war. At certain times, people have thought, for instance, that wars are justified if it brings glory to one's country, or that wars of conquest are justified. At one time in the United States, for instance, we believed in something known as manifest destiny, where we could just extend democracy in the United States anywhere and everywhere we wanted. And if that involved conquering indigenous people, then so be it. Nowadays, most people seem to think war is only justified in cases of self-defense, that it's not justified for purposes of conquest. Euthanasia also brings up a number of important ethical questions. Is euthanasia, the mercy killing of another human being, justifiable? We can scroll down the list here. Here's another type of ethical question: what makes murder wrong? Now, most everybody would regard murder as wrong. And before I go any further, let me clarify. When I mention murder here, I mean the unjustified killing of another person. I don't necessarily mean killing. Most people would regard killing in self-defense as permissible, but killing of another person, for instance, in order to steal their sneakers, or killing another person because you don't like the look on their face, most people would regard this type of action as wrong. But why? Here we see people diverge in their points of views as to the underlying justification as to why this is wrong. And then finally, why should I be moral? This is another type of ethical question. What if what's in my self-interest goes against what is required from me by morality? Why should I be moral in that case? And all of these are different questions that surface in the field of ethics. Now, when we study ethics as a discipline, it is typically divided into several different branches. And two of these include, on the one hand, what we study when we study ethical theory, and then there's also the field of ethics known as applied ethics, or sometimes it's called practical ethics. And the difference between these two is just this. In ethical theory, what we do is we try to discover the underlying principles that explain what makes actions right or wrong. We're looking for general features that explain the underlying feature, that explain and provide a foundation for what makes certain actions right or what makes certain actions wrong. Applied ethics, on the other hand, we address specific issues. Is abortion wrong? Yes or no? Why? Is euthanasia morally permissible? Are there ever times when euthanasia would be permissible? What are these times? So we're looking at very distinct types of questions when we engage in ethical theory and when we engage in applied ethics. What we're going to do in this class is we're going to spend the next several weeks focusing on ethical theory. And while we're doing that, from time to time we'll have occasion to look at specific issues. For instance, while we're looking at ethical theory, we're also going to look at certain applied issues such as criminal punishment, or the legalization of marijuana, or our duties that we have to help those in need. But we're going to be doing these with an eye to developing an ethical theory. Once we get done with this, then we're going to turn and talk exclusively about applied ethics. In particular, we're going to focus on the question of abortion and that of euthanasia. Now, there are three things we study when we study ethical theory. First, we look at actions. Should I do this or should I avoid that? When we discuss actions, we evaluate them as either being right or wrong. Your action was wrong. You should not have done that. Or your action was right. You were within your rights to have done that. Secondly, we also discuss and study what we call value. Is this thing good or is it bad? And it might seem a little confusing here to distinguish value from actions, primarily because a lot of times we use the term right and good interchangeably, as well as we use the words wrong and bad interchangeably. However, technically we can draw a distinction here. And you can see this if I give an example such as the following. For instance, suppose I say happiness is good. Well, that makes perfect sense to describe happiness as good. However, it's not quite clear that it makes a lot of sense to say happiness is right. In that case, there's a distinction between right and good. We can draw similar distinctions between wrong and bad. For instance, I might say pain is bad, but it wouldn't make a lot of sense to say pain is wrong. And the reason for this is because we use the terms right and wrong specifically and uniquely for describing actions. If I say that happiness is good, that tells you what I find valuable, but it doesn't give you any kind of instructions as to what type of actions you should perform. For instance, there are some theories that say happiness is good, therefore I should make myself as happy as possible. And so in that case, what I've done is I've described a value, happiness, and then I've laid out a particular course of action to follow. Make myself happy. Any action that makes me happy would be the right action. Other theories, however, will say happiness is good, therefore you should do what makes the majority of people happy. And notice how these two theories, they both agree that happiness is good. However, one of them tells you what you should do is make yourself as happy as possible, whereas the other theory says what you should do is make the majority of people happy. And so even though they have a similar theory of value, their theory of action is actually very, very different. One of them focuses on the individual, and the other focuses on the community. Finally, in ethics, we study human motivation. And when we talk about motivation, there are two types of things we discuss. On the one hand, there's a descriptive question. What actually motivates people to act morally? And this is to be distinguished from what we could call a prescriptive or normative question. Why should I be moral? And to make this make a little more sense, let me give you an example. For instance, suppose you help perform at a certain charity event. There's a question you might ask here is, why did you help work at the charity event? Well, maybe the reason you helped is simply because you were required to. Maybe your spouse made you. Or perhaps maybe you worked at the charity event so you could put it on your resume. And so, in this case, the descriptive question could be answered, why did you actually work at the charity event? So you could get something out of it, or you were forced to do it. Now there's a distinct question, but why should you have worked at the charity event? Well, maybe the reason you should have is because you recognize that it was the right thing to do. You recognize that it's good to help other people in need. And so here we have a distinction. Why did you do what you did versus why should you have done what you did? And so here's a difference and something else we discuss when we talk about human motivation. Now right now I want to turn our attention a little more to actions, and I want to highlight a couple of important distinctions when we evaluate actions. And these should be somewhat familiar to you. When we talk about evaluating actions, on the one hand we talk about actions being wrong, and then we also talk about actions being required. Some things are, for instance, wrong. Maybe you would agree that it's wrong to murder another human being, or rape is wrong, or theft is wrong. And then other things might be required of you. For instance, it's required that a parent take care of her child or his child. It's required, for instance, that you maybe satisfy or fulfill promises that you've made. Then other things are what we say are purely optional. For instance, something that's purely optional, that's neither required nor wrong, would be using red ink or maybe I should say black ink to write out a memo, or using blue ink to write out a memo. Maybe something that's purely optional would be adding tomatoes to your salad. Maybe some of you, like myself, don't like tomatoes, so you don't add them. Something that would be optional maybe would be I don't know, donating to charity. Maybe that's something that's optional. That's something that's not required, but it's also not wrong. Now, within this category system here, we have the wrong, we have the optional, and we also have the required. But there's another term of evaluation that we use, which is the word permissible. And something is permissible just in case it is either optional or it's required. If something is required of you, then certainly it would be permissible to do it. On the other hand, if something is optional, it's also permissible. Permissible just simply means not wrong. And something that's optional is not wrong, and something that's required is also not wrong. Now here is a particular little quirk of terminology. But the word right is sometimes used in one of two ways. Sometimes the word right is used in a very broad sense in which it means permissible. For instance, you may have heard people say things like, you are within your rights to have done a particular action. And to be within one's rights doesn't necessarily mean that it was required of you. It just means that it was okay, that it wasn't wrong. On the other hand, sometimes we use right in a very narrow sense, where we'll say that an action is required of you. Like I might say, for instance, that's the right action to perform. And in that case, what I mean is that it's required. So just pay careful attention to how we use the word right. Sometimes we use it to mean required in a very narrow sense, and sometimes we'll use it in a broad sense. And this can create confusion at times if people aren't careful with the words they use. Now, one of the key goals of ethical theory is to develop what we refer to as moral principles. And we need to be careful here as well, because when we talk about moral principles, sometimes people get confused. Because when we talk about moral principles in ordinary life, what we mean is maybe a set of principles that a person lives by. We might describe someone, for instance, as being a man or a woman of principle. And what we're referring to in that case is just that someone has a code of conduct that they rigidly adhere to and they won't deviate from. But when we talk about moral principles within the context of ethical theory, what we're referring to is a general statement that specifies conditions under which an action is right or wrong and something is good or bad. So it is a general statement that really tells us what the underlying features of rightness and wrongness are. And I'll try to make some more sense of this in the following way. So look at the list of things I have right here. Murder is wrong, stealing is wrong, lying is wrong, adultery is wrong, rape is wrong. Now hopefully you agree with the things on this list. But let me ask you, what is the common feature that all of these share? What is it that unifies all of these things? And here people offer different answers sometimes. For instance, sometimes people will say something like, well, the common feature that all of these share is that they're forbidden by God. All of these things are forbidden by God. That's what they all have in common. Other people will say something like, what unifies all these things, what they all have in common, is that they fail to maximize happiness, or they make the world a worse place, you might say. Other people offer a different answer, and what they say is that these things fail to show respect to other human beings. And each of these, what they're trying to do, what these answers are trying to do, is find a common thread that runs through this list of things we regard as wrong. And once we've identified what this common thread is, we can convert this into a moral principle. And these principles are going to specify what is it that makes these things wrong. So here's a list of possible principles. 1, an action is obligatory, or you might say an action is required if it is commanded by God, and it is wrong if it is forbidden by God. This is a possible moral principle. Some people adhere to this and some people reject it. But what it does is it basically lays out and it explains what makes an action required and what makes an action wrong. Another example, an action is obligatory or required if it maximizes happiness, and wrong if it fails to maximize happiness. A final option, an action is required if it respects others, and wrong if it does not respect others. And these three here are different moral principles. Now, there are many, many more. We're not going to talk about all the various kinds, but each of these represents, in fact, a different moral theory that is built up around these principles. In our class, we're only going to focus on the second one and the third one, and you're going to see that different moral theories are built up around these. And the value of developing a moral principle like this is that it provides us with a kind of explanation as to the underlying features of rightness and wrongness. And in addition to that, it also helps provide us with some kind of action guidance or decision procedure. That is to say that let's assume number 1 is true. Let's assume this is the right moral principle, that this truly captures what it is that's right about actions and what it is that's wrong about actions. And we're going to assume if 1 is true, that 2 and 3 are false. Well, let's say 1 is true, and we say that something is required of us if it's commanded by God, and it's wrong if it's forbidden by God. And let's suppose we come to a crossroad in our life and we have to make a decision between doing two things. And we have to ask ourselves, well, would performing this action in question be right or wrong? Well, the way we'd go about answering that is we turn to our moral principle here. And let's suppose I was contemplating, I don't know, cheating on my wife. And I was like, well, would this be wrong to do? Well, to answer that question, I'd consult my moral principle and I'd say, well, is it something that's required by God? Or is it something that's forbidden by God? And if it's something that's forbidden by God, then I can answer my question. Should I cheat on my wife? Well, no, because it's been forbidden by God. Or what if it was required by God? Well, then yes, I should. And notice that these different principles are actually probably going to provide different answers to this same question. For instance, suppose the second moral principle is right. Should I cheat on my wife? Well, would it maximize happiness for everybody, or would it fail to maximize happiness? What if cheating on my wife actually, by the way, I'm not married, just so you guys know, but what if cheating on my wife actually brought about the most happiness in the world? Well, then, if this principle is right, then I should do just that. Finally, we could look at this. Should I cheat on my wife? Well, would it show disrespect towards her? Well, presumably it would. And so this one would say that I shouldn't do that. And so the purpose really of developing one of these moral principles is really to help guide us in making decisions in those times where it's not necessarily immediately obvious what we should do. So just to summarize the discussion from the previous slide, there are two real purposes of developing an ethical theory. And on the one hand, one of our aims is a theoretical aim, which is to develop these moral principles and to discover the underlying features of actions, persons, and other items that we might morally evaluate, and to determine what makes them right and wrong, or what makes them good or bad. And this provides us just with a kind of theoretical sort of knowledge. But of course, if all we're interested in doing is developing a kind of theoretical knowledge, then it would seem kind of fruitless in a way. It would seem sterile. And so another important aim we have in developing an ethical theory is also practical in nature. And hopefully by developing these moral principles, this will provide us with some kind of, and this is a key term here, a decision procedure. And what I mean by a decision procedure is a step-by-step method for answering and knowing how to act morally. If we develop an ethical theory and it doesn't actually help guide our decision making, then it doesn't seem like it's a terribly fruitful or useful theory. And so ultimately the goal is not just theoretical, but also to have some practical payoff in the end, to tell us how we should act in particular situations. So now that I've talked a little bit about what we study when we study ethical theory, a really important question we need to ask is, how do we know when we developed a good ethical theory? If, for instance, we were studying science, we'd have pretty good ways of developing or knowing when we've developed a good scientific theory. In science, for instance, you can observe whether or not your theory holds in nature. But can we do the same thing when it comes to ethics? Can we observe and justify our theory based on any kind of scientific study? Presumably not. And so we have to know, well, if we're developing a good ethical theory, how do we know what a good ethical theory is? How do we distinguish that from a bad ethical theory? How do we know when we're not just making stuff up, so to speak? And this is actually a really complicated and difficult question to answer. And what I'm going to do is make a few suggestions to this end, to lay out a few standards that we can use to judge whether or not a theory is successful. And one thing I think that's going to be really important for a good ethical theory is what we call consistency within our theory. And what this basically means is just this: a good ethical theory should not offer contradictory advice. A good ethical theory should not tell us both that murder is right and that murder is wrong. That would be very confusing and very problematic. I'll give you an example of just such a theory. In ancient Greece, people believed that the gods, what was right is what is commanded by the gods. However, according to the Greeks, the gods offered different advice. One god would tell you to sacrifice, and another god would tell you that if you sacrificed, then you were going to be killed as a result. So what do you do in this case? What if one god gives you the order to go and invade another country, but then another god tells you that if you invade that country, you're going to be struck dead? How do you know what to do? In that case, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. And so these ancient theories of ethics, they really lacked a consistency. They would tell you to do something and to not do something. And that seems like a major problem for an ethical theory. The theory should be consistent within itself. Not only that, but the theory needs to have an overall air of plausibility. And when we're judging the plausibility of the theory, this is going to include a lot of different ways of measuring it. For instance, we should measure our theories against things that we already know to be true. For instance, maybe from psychology or history or other kinds of self-evident truths. A good theory of ethics shouldn't contradict items of information that are already proven and known to be true. Not only that, but when we judge the overall plausibility of the theory, there's also this kind of element that sometimes theories get too elaborate, too ornate, to where they can't possibly be right. And in that case, again, they would lose some air of plausibility to the theory. Thirdly, a good ethical theory should have explanatory power. And what that means is just that it should help provide light on controversial ethical issues such as abortion or euthanasia. If the theory offers no guidance, no explanatory guidance, then it seems like it's a really bad theory. A good theory of ethics should actually help illuminate difficult matters. Finally, a good ethical theory should agree with what I'm going to call our shared core morality. Now, I know that a lot of us have grown up very different, and we've grown up in different environments, and we've seen different things in our lives. However, and this might kind of seem a little surprising to you, I would imagine that despite our differences, despite having grown up in different areas, having had different parents, different upbringings, that there is a sense of morality that we all share. Now, certainly you probably have certain views of right and wrong that I don't share, and I have views of right and wrong that you don't share. But I'm willing to bet there's a lot of agreement between us. For instance, I believe that torturing a person for fun is immoral. I believe that rape is immoral. I believe that theft is wrong. I believe that killing an innocent person is wrong. And I'd be willing to bet that you guys agree with those things also. Your assignment for this week, actually, I want you guys, and you can see it on the discussion board, to list the things that you find to be immoral. And I'm going to bet that there's going to be a lot more agreement than you might initially suppose. Even though that we have different views on a lot of things, you're going to see that there's a fair amount of agreement. Not only that, but we can also rank our moral beliefs. Some things that we believe, we have a little bit of confidence in them. Some things we believe and we have a great deal of confidence in them. For instance, my views on disciplining children. I was spanked growing up. I believe that spanking children is acceptable. However, I've been presented with evidence to show me that spanking children may not be the best form of discipline, that maybe there are other forms that are more useful and they're more appropriate. And I'm willing to actually listen to arguments on this, and I'm willing to modify my views. However, there's some things that I'm really not going to change my opinion on. For instance, I believe that rape is wrong. And I can't imagine any kind of evidence being presented to demonstrate that that view is wrong, that my belief is wrong on that. And so my belief that rape is wrong or that murder is wrong, this would count for what I consider to be part of my core morality. There are going to be some things that I don't view as being unquestionably right. They're not part of my core morality. They're going to be things that are more on the fringe. Like I said, maybe my views on how you discipline children, my views on capital punishment, for instance. Those have changed over the years. There's some things that are going to be more on the periphery that aren't going to be core. And what I want to suggest is I bet there's going to be certain views that we all share, and that we not only do we share them, but we all consider them to be part of our core. We hold those views with a deep degree of confidence that these things have to be right. Killing an innocent person, torturing a person for fun, sexual abuse, child abuse, these kinds of things, I imagine we're all going to share the view that these things are wrong, and we're going to believe them with a great deal of confidence. And what I want to suggest is that a good ethical theory should account for these things. It shouldn't dismiss these things. It needs to show that these things are wrong, And if your theory says that, for instance, child molestation is morally permissible, then what I would say is that your theory is a bad theory. Your theory shouldn't explain away or dismiss these things that are considered to be core and vital, and these things that have to, or we believe, have to come out to be correct. If your theory, for instance, said that child abuse was morally permissible, I would either say that your theory is wrong or you need to have a darn good argument for why that is the case. And the truth is, if I'm to be honest, I can't imagine what such an argument would look like on the face of it. To me, any argument you provide to say that child abuse would be morally permissible, any argument you could provide would seem less obvious to me than that child abuse is wrong. And so, here's what I'm suggesting. When we theorize about ethics, we don't do this in a vacuum. We don't come to the table without any kind of moral beliefs in hand. And what I want to say is that our ethical theories, they need to take account of and not dismiss those things that are shared and that are a part of our core morality. Now, a good ethical theory might ask us to revise some of those beliefs we have that are more on the periphery, some of those ethical beliefs that we don't have as much confidence in. For instance, if I developed an ethical theory that told me that capital punishment is wrong, well, maybe that would be acceptable because my views on capital punishment, I'm not 100% convinced, and I don't think that we're going to see a great deal of consensus on that. If we look at people's views on capital punishment, what we're going to find is that people are split on that. And so even though some people might view it as deeply wrong and some people might view it as deeply acceptable, it's not something that's going to be a wide amount of consensus. So it's not going to be shared. Again, views on how we discipline children, or views on, for instance, gay marriage. People are split on these kinds of things. Our views on gay marriage, our views on abortion, our views on stem cell research, these are very controversial. We don't see a great deal of consensus on this. And so these aren't the kinds of beliefs that your ethical theory would have to rule out, or would have to have come out to be right. However, things that are shared, things that are core, these are the kinds of ethical beliefs that have to turn out to be right. Murder is wrong, rape is wrong, child abuse is wrong, torturing for fun is wrong. And if your theory doesn't have these coming out to be wrong, if your theory has something like rape is okay or that child abuse is okay, then your theory has really gone off the rails. So hopefully you'll see this week as you conduct the discussion forum that even though we've grown up very differently, that there's a lot more consensus of our shared core morality than you may have initially supposed. And hopefully you agree with me that a good ethical theory needs to account for these shared core moral beliefs, that it shouldn't explain them away or shouldn't dismiss them or rule them out.